President Nicolas Maduro is going ahead with plans to rewrite the constitution of Venezuela. With falling oil prices and the U.S. economic sanctions, people in the country are suffering a lack of medicine, food and money. After months of protests, Maduro went ahead with the Constituent Assembly election, which took place Sunday, boycotted by the opposition. Although the government said more than 8 million people, or 41.5% of the electorate, had voted, the firm behind the voting system said turnout was at least 1 million fewer than the government figure. Maduro says his aim is to stabilize the country, while his opponents claim he only wants to consolidate his own power. Today, to discuss Venezuela's political crisis and its consequences, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Jiang Shixue, Director at the Center for Latin American Studies, Shanghai University, Anna Tangen, author and columnist, and Wang Weijun, an independent researcher. We shall also talk to Charles Tang, chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry, via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui.
At the dead of night, this. Antonio Ledesma, 62-year-old elected Caracas mayor, is bundled out of his home by Venezuelan state security. He was still in his pajamas. At the same time, intelligence agents were also taking Leopoldo Lopez away from his home. He's Venezuela's most popular opposition leader, who was only transferred to house arrest last month. He had been expecting this to happen, so much so that he prepared a video in case.
If
you are watching this video right now, it is precisely because that is what happened. Because they came unjustly to make me an illegal prisoner, a prisoner of conscience, a prisoner because of my ideas, a prisoner for wanting a better Venezuela.
Both men are understood to now be in a military prison outside Caracas. The move came just hours after President Maduro was sanctioned by the US government and accused of being a dictator for moving ahead with the establishment of a constituent assembly, an all-powerful body which will overrule parliament here. The president, addressing his US counterpart as Emperor Donald Trump, had this to say.
I will not obey imperial orders. I do not obey foreign governments. Not today, nor tomorrow will I obey imperial orders.
He insists he will set up his assembly on Thursday. But the existing legislature, the opposition-controlled National Assembly, was visited by the ambassadors of the UK, France, Spain and Mexico. They were making the point that whatever President Maduro may say, this is the parliament their governments recognize.
Gentlemen, I'm so surprised that President Maduro has been able to survive the current political crisis for up to 4 months. Now, Anna, what do you think is the driving force or the source of resilience for his government to survive so much of the political struggle and the chaos there?
Well, he has a hardcore group of people who support him. It's growing smaller and smaller as things like bread, medicine, food, all of these things start to disappear. I mean, basically it's been in complete chaos for the last 4 months, but you could trace it back at least 4 years.
Mr. Jiang, I'm also surprised that the military seems to be so patient. It's not involved in any serious attempt to overthrow the government and President Maduro. Why do you think the military of Venezuela decides to take side with its president?
Well, first of all, I would say it must follow the principle of democracy, staying quietly in the camp. And secondly, I would say in the past more than 10 years, the government has offered lots of financial support for the military. So I would say the military is a kind of a beneficiary from the government to all kinds of programs.
What do you think of the resilience of the Venezuelan government?
I don't much agree with Mr. Jiang, because the armed forces in Latin America has a very old tradition, especially in a country like Venezuela, which Bolívar has a very strong reputation there. and the militaries, they sustain a very strong ideal for the loyalty and the dedication. Actually, the military forces is the most important legacy and the most valuable element to the Maduro's government, I think, nowadays.
That's the most important legacy from Hugo Chavez.
Chavez, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I see.
And especially nowadays, as far as I have read, the elite of the armed forces are very, very loyal to the government.
Elites of the military in Venezuela remain pretty loyal to President Maduro. But what about the economic policy, which seems to be seriously flawed? Anna.
Well, it continues. The irony is that Venezuela is one of the richest countries in Latin America, yet it's almost solely dependent on oil revenues. And as oil has dropped, so has their ability. They leverage too much money onto their oil revenues, and in addition to that, they did not take care of their oil fields. Right now, they're producing at literally half of what they could be producing, simply because they have not put the money into maintenance and repairs. So at this point, this is a country that half of its foreign exports are oil, 1/3 of its GDP is linked to oil, and they are unfortunately not able to make it at the current world prices.
Fiscal revenue of Venezuela depends on oil.
But it's a failed state.
95%.
Yes.
Can I just add one point? Well, if you want to say why the economy is terribly run, well, the main reason I would say the government from Chavez to Maduro now cannot deal with the relationship between the market and the government. The government intervenes with the economy so heavily, you know.
Are you talking about central planning policy that we had during the counter-revolution?
Chavez once said, why should the central government have independence? But as you know that every country in the world must allow the central bank to have its own independence. Chavez said no.
Well, I think there's more nuance to that. The fact is that they don't have a plan. This is not like China, where you have a 5-year plan, you balance things out, you have reserves, and you have a legitimate business plan. Everything was banked on the dollars that were coming in from the oil revenues, and when those disappeared, there has been no subsequent plan.
Well, even worse than the Russian economy, which is excessively reliant on the oil exports and the exports of other raw materials. So let me cross over to Mr. Charles Tang, Chairman of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry from Brazil. Hello, Charles. Charles?
Yeah, hi, Young Ray.
It seems the spectrum of public opinions has been pretty divided among and between countries of Latin America with regard to the establishment of a constituent assembly in Venezuela. And the establishment of this organization seems to have triggered the current round of a political crisis that almost crippled the economy of Venezuela. Now tell me the position of the Brazilian government. Why?
Well, as you know, Brazil is no longer governed by the Workers' Party, which were very strong allies to Chavez and to Maduro. The Temer government, of course, condemns what is happening in Venezuela. And Venezuela is not only a lack of planning, but every time you try to dictate economic law and remove it from supply and demand, it's really a very interesting case study on how to destroy the economics of a very rich country in a very short period of time. On the opposite side of the scale, we have China, which was a very poor country, and in a very short period of time became a very economically powerful country. So, you know, when you try to institute populist measures and dictate the rules of economy, you basically will destroy the economy of the country. And it's such a shame. When my son visited Venezuela last year, the item that his friends asked him to bring was toilet paper. So a friend of mine who owns a large chain of supermarkets in Venezuela, in Caracas, is asking us to please help him exchange the currency so that he can buy products for his supermarkets, because all the shelves are empty. So Venezuela has destroyed its entire production sector, and like was said before, did not maintain the oil production facilities, so that even the oil production has been falling in a rapid speed.
The sharp
Now,
drop in oil prices
Venezuela
certainly
also
occurs
does not
for
have
the
enough
economic
refineries.
performance of Venezuela. But Wei Jin, a humble student of Castro, a former leader, late leader of Cuba, Hugo Chavez, the late president of Venezuela, may have done much of the same measure to confiscate properties and assets owned by multinationals, and most of them came from the United States, and therefore Americans got angry. Other than the issue of imposing more sanctions against Maduro's administration, what do you think of the relationship between the market, if any, in Venezuela and the Americans?
I think even the relationship between Venezuela and the United States are not quite normal now. But I think that these two countries, the link between these two countries will be maintained, is no doubt, because Venezuela represents the very important oil supply to the United States, and the United States will never give up Venezuela as a oil supplier. Also, this is a very great export market for the U.S. industry. So I think now we can observe another fact, that the approach of the U.S. government to Venezuela has been moderate. There is no very fierce sanctions against Venezuela. So I think this is maybe this is part of the United States foreign policy, especially dealing with the Latin American countries.
Yeah, but I would counter that. There have been in the last 2 days attempts, announcements by both in Congress and in Trump's administration that they will enforce sanctions, that they're preparing sanctions against it. They have denounced this last vote as being a sham, and they have joined a chorus of votes around the world.
In essence, President Maduro has been frozen by the United States. So what do you think of the bite of economic sanctions against the Constituent Assembly?
Well, it's not against the Constituent Assembly is nothing more than 350 people he appointed directly, in essence, and then another 150 people who were elected by small groups that were designated workers, women's groups, things like this, unions. They're not really, no one really recognizes them. I don't think of things. The economics, as we've all discussed, is very clear. There's absolutely no way they can dig themselves out of the hole. They don't have food on their shopping mall.
Just let me add one point. One of the possible U.S. sanctions is to stop selling refined oil to Venezuela. Don't think that Venezuela is an oil-producing country and it can meet its own demand. It's refining.
It doesn't have its own oil refinery?
Well, it has some kind of refining capacity, but the capacity has been weakened greatly over the past 1 or more decades. So Venezuela relies on imported oil from the U.S. and other countries. So if the U.S. stops selling refined oil, that will cause great trouble for Venezuela.
The next question, Wei Jin, where did the money go? I mean, the Venezuela government has over past decades generated a lot of oil wealth. Why didn't they invest the wealth in the construction of a refinery and other industries? It seems this economy is a failed one for apparent reasons you guys have mentioned, spoken of. To my knowledge, this government in Venezuela refused to make serious investment in the enlargement of their economic structure or in other industries. Why? Is that a factor of ideology?
Right. You know, I think this is a problem not only in Venezuela. in Latin America, there is some countries very successful, like Chile. Chile is the most open economy. Actually, Chile has not much industry neither, but Chile adopted a very open economy way. And Venezuela used to be and have been the richest country in Latin America, but they have never invested in. But Venezuela has never had even simple industrial structure, you know. So this is a completely consuming country. But I do
domestic consumption instead of having a fine economic structure.
But you also have to agree that it was the richest country in Latin America, but the disparity between the rich and the poor was enormous. There were people in Caracas who would fly to their homes from helicopter.
Hey, come on, the socialist ideology,
no, this changed
ideology means heavy subsidies for the poor, the low income.
Subsidies that have to be paid for. If you can't pay for it, you can't give it away.
Your take.
4 years ago, when the oil prices was very high, the government put aside a certain amount of money into the so-called sovereign wealth fund. But in the past 4 years, the prices has been declining heavily. So the government is not able to put aside some money for the rainy day. The government has spent lots of money on social programs.
Right, that's my point. Social programs means it's able to cover the well-being of ordinary individuals, right?
Let me finish.
But giving money away when you can't buy anything at the supermarket doesn't make any sense.
No, Charlestown, we heard just now that Charlestown said that the government has been given lots of money by implementing so-called populist policies. Okay, I would like to say that I criticize the government for failing to manage the economy, but in terms of social programs, I would say Maduro or Chavez has done a good job by offering all kinds of help, medicine, education to the poor people. If we ask poor people in Venezuela, what do you think of the government? I think you will get an answer.
But there's no medicine there now, so how have they helped?
You know, I think in Latin America in nowadays there is a big problem. This is a lot of politics. They do not
politicians.
Politicians. They do not make a politics for the development of economy, but only for election. The problem happens in Brazil, the PT, the Labor Party, and I think
Workers' Party,
and then Maduro is the same. They just give up to the food and some simple medicines to the poor people in return for the vote.
But you cannot say the government buy votes. I would say it's necessary for the government to allocate some money.
But there's
for the benefit of the poor people.
I know, but there's a middle ground. You have to maintain the economy, or you cannot maintain the benefits. And if I say to you, I'm going to give you something,
let's go to Charlestown for his comments on whether in Brazil it's much the same. The government is not interested in making serious investment. Instead, they buy votes. They spend a lot of the social security programs or sovereign fund for the purchase of loyalty from the electorate. Is that the case, Charles, in your country?
Yeah, I don't think you can compare the Workers' Party with what Maduro is doing. As we recall, during President Lula's government of 8 years, Brazil grew, was one of the most fastest growing countries in the whole world. And although Brazil has the Bolsa Familia, which provides subsidies to the poorest families, this subsidy doubled the size of the Brazilian economy. One thing is to mismanage entirely the economy of the country through, dictating populist measures going against the law of supply and demand. And another is to utilize he was able to bring 40 million Brazilian families out of total misery to join the middle class. So I predict that in Venezuela we will see a lot of trouble, because although you say the military elite is in favor at this moment of the Maduro government is not only because of loyalty, it's also because, you know, the military elite are very wealthy. But as you know, the military elite sometimes can face problems with the majority of the military that are not participating as much in the wealth of the country. So I believe that there is no comparison between Brazil and Venezuela.
The next question, Charles, is our relationship, Beijing's relationship with Caracas. There have been rumors that we spend billions of dollars in our investment in this failed economy, quote unquote, and there could be a slim chance for us to enjoy a healthy return from the investment. Now, given the political instability and your observations about this country of Venezuela, what's the real situation? Let's hear a true story about the risk that comes along with our investment in this country. There's the rumor, I don't want to talk too much about the rumor, but this rumor has been going on for months, that we bought a small island that was designated by the Venezuelan government as a compensation, as a part of the return for Chinese investment. Now this sounds pretty ridiculous. Charles?
Well, I think that to the extent that the Chinese investments are guaranteed by future purchases of petroleum, that part can be fairly safe. But the majority of the investments, whether Chinese or other foreign investments, I do believe that they will run into non-performing risks.
Non-performing risks?
We should not get ourselves confused by two terminologies, loans and investment. China and Venezuela, there is a treaty, a kind of a, which is called oil for loans. Okay, so it's totally different from the investment. Investment is investment, loans are loans. So China's cooperation with Venezuela is based on world market rules. Okay, so China offered loans and backed up by oil exports. But investment, as far as I know, based on my humble knowledge about Venezuela, Chinese investment are making money. And also almost 1/3 of the loans is not paid yet, but it's okay. The loans are backed up by the oil reserves of Venezuela.
And your response?
I think nowadays the Chinese people, the most discussed such issue is really the relationship between Chinese government and Venezuela. I agree with Mr. Jiang. The investment, Chinese investment, is most in the oil field. And as far as I know, the loans from Chinese government is from Chinese government, from the State Development Bank. This is covered by the sovereignty guarantee. And the government changes. For example, if another government assumed the obligation is the state. But another thing, I think, if we observe the issue from the business point of view, any business has a risk, you know. Any business has a risk, but also the loans from Chinese government to Venezuela maybe has some political concern also.
Well,
political considerations.
Along
with the loans.
We call it political risk. And quite frankly, you know, all you're saying is great. If they had maintained their oil fields, if they had put money into creating refineries, if they had gone up market and downstream in terms of providing new products, I mean, more high value-added products, but they didn't do that. Right now, as we said, they have drastically reduced their output simply because they don't do maintenance. That is the issue that we're talking about. So how you're going to repay loans with a government that is not even maintaining the source of its wealth sounds very tricky to me. Now, Maduro came in, he got rid of the foreign nationals, foreign companies. He said, look, we're taking this over, we're taking it all back, it's going to be for the benefit of the country. The same thing can happen with loans. So there's always a political risk. I think China has a path to negotiate that, but a lot will depend on what happens and whether there's a civil war
Despite
there.
the end of the Cold War, gentlemen, what do you think of the lingering suspicion shared by some of the Chinese observers here that there is a strong factor of ideology in our relationship with Venezuela? And that therefore, in their eyes, they see there's a cozy picture, a rosy picture about the relationship between Havana, Beijing, between Caracas and Beijing. Because in both countries, Cuba and Venezuela, you have the left-leaning governments. And this voice from China has good reasons to take into consideration the factor of ideology. Shi Xuan, what do you think?
I have some friends who are in the U.S. Teaching in the university as kind of professors or scholars. They said, well, look at China. China is a communist country, and also Chavez is a so-called leftist country. So why do you support Venezuela? Without China's support, Venezuela will not survive for one day. That's ridiculous. You cannot.
Is it ridiculous? Is it ridiculous?
Of course.
Really, is it ridiculous?
You cannot blame the story in Venezuela on China. China's cooperation with Venezuela is based on a kind of a world market rules. Okay, it's a kind of a South-South cooperation. It's a win-win situation for both sides.
If they pay it back.
I have another observation. I think also China has to diversify its oil supply. And when I was very young, I was told that only Maracaibo Lake supplied all the Allied armies during the Second World War. The oil quality and the production of Venezuela, you can never...
Can't be better.
Yeah.
No, it's comparable to Saudi and Iraqi light crude.
The crude oil is of a good quality.
And I also do not believe that if the United States cut the refined oil, gasoline to Venezuela, it will turn the situation completely.
But
there are other sources, but it just becomes more expensive. But there's this, I mean, ideologically, we have to agree that there's a seesaw battle that goes on between right-wing and left-wing governments come in. And right now, the sea change has been against left-wing governments. You've seen this in Brazil. You've seen this in Argentina. You can't ignore these things. The desire to do good for people is wonderful. And you get populist governments say that we're going to give you subsidies. But the fact is, that is not going to bring people out of poverty. And China, of all countries, knows this. And
your point about the country risks is very important. As you know, South America, Central America, and even the Caribbean are going to be included in China's Belt and Road strategy. So more Chinese companies are expected to make more investments in the region. I want to say, be careful of the country risks in the region. You must understand there are all kinds of country risks over there.
Very quickly, just very quick answer from you, Mr. Jiang. The Chinese are very much concerned about the U.S. Anxiety because of Monroe Doctrine. So we want to be less ideologically driven in our investment. Is that a positive answer from you?
Yes.
Thank you so much. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue, focusing on the political scenario of Venezuela, which has been plunged into chaos ever since the announcement that the Maduro administration decided to set up their Constituent Assembly to replace the National Assembly, and that's viewed by the Western observers as a violation of democracy or democratic principle. That's a pretty controversial topic. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.